Hi, I'm Dino of Majestic Arms. We're here today to introduce you to and teach you to install our newest product, the Speed Strip Kit Master Grade. The Master Grade culminates everything I know how to do for you. We'll take a look at one of the kits laid out here on the table. You get our two-piece bolt stop pin for the rapid dismantling and easy reassembly. You get our hammer sear bushing arrangement for a nice trigger pull in the range of about 2.5 pounds. You get one of our speed triggers with the over travel adjustment screw, and now the latest addition is a disconnector bar with an oversized sear tab that does require some final fitting, but it'll be worth the effort because it's going to give you the shortest possible stroke on the trigger, which equals and the quickest possible return and reset on the trigger. So let's get started. We're going to install one today in a standard Ruger 5.5-inch stainless steel bull barrel, Mark III. So first thing we do is check to make sure the gun's not loaded. We must remove the magazine, drop the bolt. This gun still has a magazine disconnector, so I have to put the magazine back in and dry fire the gun. Now we can remove the magazine and lie it aside. We're going to take a small screwdriver. We're going to open the little pocket knife-like latch attachment of the mainspring housing assembly. I like to come in from the corner, pry the latch open, then you can hinge your mainspring housing assembly away from the frame. Some of these guns you can grab them and just pull them down. This one's very tight, so I'm going to use a nylon punch. A wooden dowel will work just as well. And I'm going to tap on that pin with the housing open to get that down and out. Now there's our mainspring housing assembly. We can lie that aside. The next thing we want to do now is remove the bolt and lay that aside. Now we must dismount the upper receiver and barrel assembly from the pistol grip frame. Now a lot of people are going to hold it like this and they're going to strike the back with a mallet, and although that method works well, I don't prefer it. It's very easy to miss, hit, damage, or break your sights. So the way I like to dismount it is I'm going to take a firm grip across the upper receiver and I'm going to take a grip on the grip frame. And on a padded surface here on my workbench, I'm going to come down and I'm going to give it one good blow here on the back of the receiver, which will push it forward and dismount it from the grip frame. There we go. I'm going to set that aside. Now I'm going to take a flat-bladed screwdriver. We're going to remove the grip panels from both sides. Okay, I've got the grip panels off. Now what we're going to do is first thing we're going to do is remove our hammer assembly. This pin right here is your hammer pivot pin. I'm going to push on it. I'm going to tip the hammer up a little bit so I can get a grip on it. I'm going to pull the pin out far enough to release the hammer, but I don't want the other parts to fall out just yet. If they do, don't worry, we'll put it all back together. Hinge out the disconnector bar. Right here we have three pieces. We have a piece of tubing, dog-leg shaped piece of sheet metal with a corresponding spring. These three components are what comprise your magazine disconnecting feature. Now we're not going to use that. This gun will not have a magazine disconnector when we're done. So we're going to take those three parts, we're going to put them in the discard pile. The next thing we're going to do is we're not going to reuse the original hammer. We're going to use the new one that came with your kit. But we are going to retain the hammer strut and the strut retaining pin. So I'm going to take those off right now. And I take a 332 punch on my bench block. And I just tap out the pin. So the strut and the strut retaining pin we will reuse. The hammer we will not, and that goes in the discard pile. At this point, you can finish by just pulling out the hammer pin. When you do so, the safety is going to fall out. I want to just show you something. I'll take a pause for the camera to catch up. In the shaft of your safety, you have a little spring and a plunger. That's what gives the detent action to your safety from the fire to the safe position. Let's just be mindful that you don't lose them. It's a real easy thing to do. Take off the bolt stop lever, lay it aside. Now we're going to remove the sear. We have the sear pin right here. I'm just going to push on that, and I'm going to turn it upside down. And out came our sear pin, and our sear spring. Once again, another part we're not going to reuse. We're not going to reuse the factory sear. We're going to use the new one that came in your kit. So we lay that aside. And now what we need to do is remove the original trigger. I'm going to take an 1/8 inch punch from the left side to the right side only, drive out the pin that retains the trigger. And once you drive that out, You've got on the left side the bolt stop. That'll come right out. You lay that aside. You've got the bolt stop plunger and spring. That'll come out. We're going to reuse those. Now we take out our trigger and our disconnector bar. In the center of the trigger is a spring and plunger that it returns the trigger and operates the disconnector bar. We're going to save those. The original trigger and disconnector bar is now discarded. So let's get started installing the kit. First thing we'll work with is the new trigger. In the center you have an over travel adjustment screw. What I like to do is take the 1/16 of an inch Allen key that was supplied in your kit, and it's a cup point screw. And they often have burrs at the tail end, so what I'll do is with diamond needle file, some sandpaper wrapped around a stick will work just as well. I just like to get rid of the burrs so I have a nice clean flat surface to work with. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to check the fit of my trigger into the frame. Some of these frames, that window, the cutout, can be very rough, and oftentimes it is not parallel. So I'm going to slide the trigger in, and I want to see a little bit of light on either side of the trigger. In this particular case, I've got a trigger window that has a little bit of a raised spot right in the middle. It's not very parallel at all. It's on the left side. So I'm going to take a hand file, and I'm not going to remove much. Just going to remove a little bit of material, and I'm going to check and see that I can see light on either side of the trigger. Right now I can. That looks very good. What I'll do for good measure is I'll take some 240 sandcloth. I'll wrap that over the file that I just used, just like so, and I'll come back in and I'll just smoothen it. At this point I'm really not looking to change any dimensions. I already kind of did that, and I just want to smoothen that out. So now at this point the trigger should drop in. I should see light on either side, which I do, and I'm ready to put my pin in. Trigger pin is a little bit of a tough fit. I have a cutaway here that I can show you. Pause for the camera to catch up. We have a spring in the frame. The trigger pin has a corresponding groove. The spring runs under the pin, and that's what locks the pin in place, is the spring. So we'll get back to the gun. Usually you can just with your thumb push the pin in and get it started. And at this point I'll check. The trigger's got free motion. That feels good. Now I'm going to put my bolt stop arrangement back in. We have a spring and a plunger, and the plunger has half of it cut away. The cutaway side goes towards the wall of the frame. There's a little hole in the lug right next to the trigger. And I'll pause, see if the camera can catch up how that plunger goes in. I apologize if our camera does not catch any of the details. And that goes in just like that. This is the part that actually locks open your bolt on the inside. This lug must come through this window in the frame. So we insert it just like so. We bring it in, we line it up with the plunger, and the easy way to do this is to look through the hole like looking through a window, push the part until you see it line up, and the pin should click right back into place. We have free motion on the trigger. That's very good. Now we're ready to move on. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the new sear from Majestic arms. I'm going to put that out in the center of the table. I'm going to pause again for the camera to catch up. I want to show you the orientation. The sear has a radius cutout. The radius cutout faces the back of the grip frame, always. That's the proper orientation. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put our sear spring back in the frame. Now, the sear spring has one long leg, 3 coils, and a short leg. The long leg goes against the frame, the 3 coils towards the center of the frame with the short leg sticking up. There's also a correct orientation. The 3 coils being towards the center and the short leg sticking up, that's the orientation, with this being the front of the frame and this being the back. This part's a little bit of a trick. I'm going to use locking forceps. If you don't have them, a pair of long needle nose pliers with some rubber bands around the end will work quite well. What I'm going to do, I'm going to hold my sear spring like that. And the way this works, you'll see another pin here in the frame, right there. The long end of that sear spring bears on that pin, just like so. So I take my sear pin, and I start it through the frame. I take my sear spring, and I come in and I put the coils right in the center of the pin. And now at this point, I'm going to push the pin so that it just holds the spring in place. Once again, I'm sorry, I'll take a pause, but I don't know if our camera can catch that detail for you. Okay, now we're going to take this sear with the radius cut out towards the back. We're going to grasp it with our forceps, and I'm going to come in from the back and I'm going to walk it forward, and I'm going to feel spring tension, and I'm going to walk it forward until I feel the spring tension and push on the pin and get it through both sides of the frame. Now at this point we're going to put our safety back in. As we had discussed earlier, in the shaft of the safety there's a little spring and a plunger. We must be mindful not to lose them. This is going to be a little bit of a finagle, and here's how we do it. We bring the shaft of the safety through the frame. Once we get it through the frame, we take a punch and we push it flat up against the frame. We pivot our sear forward and we pivot the safety down. You've got to keep these parts held in position at this point. This is where the finagle comes in. Take your bolt stop lever. It goes on to the rivet of your bolt stop. You line it up. Now the hammer pin goes through the bolt stop lever, through the frame, through the safety, and then it'll continue through the hammer. But for this point, I just want to show you, I'll pause and let the camera take a good look. That's exactly how that assembly should look. Now what we're going to do is, in the center of the trigger we have a spring and a plunger. It's what activates your trigger and your disconnector bar. We're going to put them back into the hole in the center of the trigger. We're going to pivot that disconnector bar back for a moment, and that'll all stay assembled just like that. Now it's time to get the new hammer ready. Take our hammer, take the bushing out. We're going to retain the strut and the pin. The strut does indeed have an orientation. It has a straight edge and it has a radius edge. The straight edge always faces the front portion of the frame. The radius always faces the back of the frame. So I'm going to take the retaining pin, and on the left side of the hammer I'm going to start it through the hole. The easiest way to do this is to orient your parts, bring the strut into the hammer looking through the hole like a window. When it all looks right, I'm actually going to hit the hammer and tap it down onto the pin, just like that. Now if you look at the original Ruger pin, they fit very loosely when they're new, and then they dimple them, which means they take a punch and give it a little stake and flare the end slightly to retain it. So I've got a sharpened punch. I'm going to put it in the hole and just give it a little bit of a stake so she stays nice and snug. Now I'm going to take the bushing, I'm going to put it into the right side of the hammer. Now we're ready to do an installation and check. This will not work the first time because, as I mentioned, the disconnector bar has an oversized dimension. Before I put this in, I'll mention that. This is the disconnector bar tab that engages your sear. The forward edge we left oversized. And let me show you why. I'm going to go to a cutaway that I made for this film. These guns have a long, slacky two-stage trigger pull because there's a lot of play between the disconnector bar and the sear. This gun's got one of our newer bars in it, so it's not a lot of play. But what we're doing is, when the gun fires, the disconnector bar is pushed down, disconnects, lets the sear get back on the job. When we release the trigger, the disconnector bar must step up, get behind the sear, and reset for the next shot. By leaving that oversized, at first it won't work. The first time we assemble it, we're going to verify that. And we're going to remove a little bit of material at a time from that tab until we get proper disconnection. And that'll give you the shortest possible stroke on the trigger. So let's put the hammer into the frame and see where we're at from there. Again, I like to use the window principle. I look through a hole on the opposite side. When I see them line up, I push it into place. Cock our hammer back. And when now the disconnector bar is behind the sear on the job, when I pull the trigger, it releases the hammer. I'm going to simulate firing by cocking the hammer backward, and I'm going to push the disconnector bar down just like the bolt does, and I'm holding the hammer in the cocked position. When I release it, you can see that disconnector bar cannot get up behind the sear. That's perfect. It's exactly how we designed it. Now I'm going to teach you a shortcut to fit the disconnector bar without removing it from the frame. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to gently pull on the hammer pin, just enough to release the hammer, but not the rest of the parts. Pivot out my disconnector bar. It's very easy to lose the spring and plunger in the middle of your trigger, so I'm going to take them out for the time being. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to take my bench block, I'm going to lay it here, and on the forward edge of the disconnector bar, I'm going to take a safe-edged file, which means the edge is smooth and does not cut. I'm going to keep it square, and I'm going to come in and take a few passes. The amount of material we're removing for a perfect fit is between 8 and 12 thousandths of an inch. Not a lot, it's pretty easy to do. That's a preliminary. Let's reassemble it, and let's give it a function check. Put our hammer in our disconnector bar, bring the arrangement back into the frame. Let's check disconnection. Pull the trigger, the hammer releases, simulate cocking it, push down on the disconnector and see if we have disconnection. We still do not. It's not getting up behind the sear, so we've got to remove just a little bit more material. Go back to my shortcut, pull the pin out just enough to release the hammer, leave all of those parts assembled, take out the plunger and spring, go back to the bench block, and remove a little bit more material. Let's give that another function check. Cock the hammer, disconnect the bars on the job, pull the trigger, the hammer goes, cock it backward, push down on the disconnector, keep the hammer in the cock position. Now if you notice, the disconnector bar came up, got back on the job, that's what we're looking for, but it's a little bit rough. That's perfect, we're right in the home stretch. So I'm going to push out my pin, revert to my shortcut, take out the spring and plunger to not lose them. We're in the home stretch now, so we're just going to remove a little bit of material and give it a nice finish. Please remember the golden rule. You can always remove more material, but you can't put anything back. So here I'm going to very carefully just take 2 passes, or maybe 3. But now I'm going to change. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch aluminum oxide stone from Brownells, and I'm going to give that file cut surface a nice smooth clean finish. When we cut with a file, we usually leave burrs. I'm going to do one different thing. I'm going to lay it sideways this way. I'm going to clean it. Now I'm going to turn my stone on a 45-degree angle, and I want to have that corner have a slight bevel and not a rough edge. I know the camera won't catch it, but I'm looking. I've got the bevel, holding my stone at a 45-degree angle. Then again, this way, just make sure you get any of the rough burrs that the file cutting left off. Smooth is good, rough is not. Let's assemble it again and see where we are. Put the spring and the plunger back in the center of the trigger. Take my hammer and bushing arrangement, put it back into the disconnector bar, which now should just about be perfectly fitted. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to employ the whole mainspring housing assembly. You can assemble this and get this whole thing assembled without the upper receiver and operate the whole lower grip frame with no upper receiver. It's a really nice trick, and it allows you to see everything that's going on. So, I'm going to simulate firing the gun. Hammer fires, bolt cocks it back, pushes down the disconnector. I released the trigger, the disconnector got back on the job. It's happening, but it's still just a little shade rough. So we're just going to give it a little bit more cleanup, and that'll should do for the fitting on our disconnector. So, one more time, revert to my shortcut. Take out the pin just far enough to release the hammer. Take out the spring and the plunger. I'm going to give it one pass with the file and then clean it again with the stone, and I should be just about done. And bear in mind the stone is also removing a shade of material, less than the file, but it's removing some material nonetheless. Turn to a 45-degree angle, bevel it, bring my stone around, make sure I've got nice clean surfaces, no rough burrs hanging there that's going to cause me a disconnector problem. Let's put it back together again. This should be the last one. I'm going to just go right ahead and put the mainspring housing assembly back in. This way I've got spring tension on my hammer, and I'm completely simulating the whole cycle when the gun is completely assembled. Disconnect the bars on the job, gun dry fires, push down, release. She comes right back up smoothly. And there she is. She's set up just right. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the over travel adjustment screw in the center of the trigger. Now the purpose of that screw is very simple. All it does is it stops the trigger's motion at the end after it's moved just far enough to release the sear and hammer. And it stops the trigger so that there's no continuous motion after that, and that gives you a really nice feel on the trigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first do a preliminary setup. At this point you can look inside and actually see the whole arrangement. So I'm going to pull the trigger, see how far the sear moves. It continuously moves past releasing the sear. So we got about 3/4 of a turn to go. We'll set that up again. And I'm going to give it one more quarter turn for a really nice feel. Now the trigger moves just far enough to release the hammer with the least amount of motion. Cock the hammer, push down on the disconnector. Disconnector comes right back up on the job. Alright, that concludes the fitting for the lower half. You can take out the mainspring housing assembly, and I can move on now and finish up the installations. One thing I'd like to do now while I've got it all apart is I'm going to give it a lubricant. I like Shooter's Choice FP10. I think it's one of the finest lubricants that's ever been introduced to the firearms industry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some FP10. I'm going to put a little bit on my bolt lock open assembly. It also get some on the left side of the trigger, a little on the right side where the disconnector bar meets the trigger also. One drop right on my spring and my plunger. And I like to put a drop on the left side, the right side of the hammer, and then a nice drop right on the top of the disconnector bar. That's properly lubricated. Now we're going to reseat the upper receiver to the pistol grip frame. Now the way this works, I'll pause, let the camera catch up. If I hold it on an angle like that, you might see it better. We have a lug and a hook in the front of the frame that's going to lock into a corresponding cutout in the upper receiver. These guns fit very, very tightly together for the most part, and the reason is we're actually galling two pieces of metal together. So what I like to do saves wear and tear on the gun and makes it easier to dismount and put it back together, is I'm going to put a grease on the lower section of that lug to prevent galling. Again, Shooter's Choice, one of my favorite brand of products. We use them here in the shop almost exclusively. I'm a big fan of it. This is their all-weather grease, works in all temperatures. It's really good stuff. What I'm going to do is just give it a squirt of grease right on the bottom end of that lug. Don't need a lot. A little bit goes a long way in this area. What we're going to do is we're going to remount the upper receiver to the grip frame. So we bring the two halves together. Right now they fit really snugly. Now what we're going to do is we're going to remount them. Now once again, people will beat on the muzzle with a mallet. I don't like it. It's too easy to hit your sights and damage something. So I'm going to take a firm grip like this. I've got the upper receiver and the grip frame together. I'm going to put my hand in the back, and I'll come right here in the corner of my bench. There's a leg here, so it's very sturdy. And I'm going to give it one good thump. Now the upper receiver should overhang your grip frame a slight amount, about a 32nd of an inch. Now at this point the hammer must be cocked back. The other thing I'd like to point out, caution must be used. When the grips are off on these guns, all of these pins essentially can walk out of place. The grips are side panels and hold them in. So at this point while you're working with the gun, a lot of caution must be used that none of the pins drift out of the frame, your sear pin or your hammer pin. What we're going to do now is we're going to get the bolt ready. The recoil spring guide assembly, we do a quick little modification on here, makes life simple. The end of it is crimped together. They take a piece of steel rod that's got a split in it, they slide the spring on, they put in the horseshoe, and then they crimp the two edges together. We're going to make a little bit of a concave with a slight bevel front and rear, and that'll make for a lot easier operation. Now, you can do this with a round file, a pillar file. You can do it with a stick with some sandpaper wrapped around it. I'm going to use my trusty Dremel tool. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give that a little bit of a concave. Now I'm going to give it a bevel. And there we go, we're done. I'll bring that up and I'll I'll take a pause, let the camera take a look at it. I hope we can show you that, show you how I've modified the end of that recoil spring guide rod. Alright, now we take the T, we drop it into the corresponding slot in the bolt, put it into place. Now is a good time, a little FP10 on either side of the bolt. At this point now we're going to do the Ruger dance. You got to do every step of the dance in the right order. This is what's driven people nuts for years. At this point the hammer must be in a cocked position to allow the bolt back into the receiver. Now we want the hammer just the opposite. The hammer must be uncocked and all the way forward against the bolt, but conversely the little strut must be down parallel to the grip frame. Now there's no spring on the job yet. Gravity might do the job, but it might not. I'm going to look in the back, find the hammer, just push on it with my little screwdriver, pull the trigger and push the hammer forward and keep the strut down. Now we're up to the last thing we need to do. We need to change out the solid bolt stop pin for the new two-piece design. This calls for an 1/8 inch punch. And the way to do this, the easiest way, just tap on it carefully, just enough to release the old pin. There's no need to punch the pin completely out of the assembly. It'll be a simpler job if you don't. Take out the old pin, I'm not going to use it anymore, put it in the pile. Now here's how I like to do this. I bring in the new two-piece bolt stop pin and I use my little window trick. I'm going to look down on it. When I see it's all aligned, I'm going to hit the mainspring housing assembly down onto the pin. Okay, that was easy enough. Now, the other thing, last, is that there are little dimples on the edge of that pin. Ruger does that to make them stay put. So I'm going to take my punch, and I'm going to give each side the tiny little dimple, just beef up the one that's already there, that's fine. And now that's nice and snug. Alright, we're ready to put the mainspring housing assembly back into the gun and do our final checking. So we start by taking the pin, snaking it up through the frame. Now oftentimes this will be tight and it will require tapping of a mallet, not a hammer, so I'm going to turn this around. And if it is tight, you tap right here to drive the whole pin up and seat it. Now the last part, that little strut that dangles from your hammer, excuse me, must find itself into this V notch. The bottom of that V notch, there's a cup that sits on top of your mainspring which resides inside this housing. The way I do it is I make the strut lean directly on the forward portion of the housing, and I hold the gun upside down. So as I close this, I'm essentially enveloping that pin and getting it in. And if that happens, it means the strut stepped out of place and it's not properly aligned with the mainspring housing assembly. So we have to open this. Okay, I got my mainspring housing assembly open. Once again, I'm going to look, identify the strut, make it lean on the housing, and close it in such a way that you envelop the pin, the strut rather. Now let's check for function. Again, be mindful none of your pins drift. Bolt functions, nice short stroke, nice trigger pull. Now we're going to do a disconnector check. I'm going to hold the trigger, maintain pressure, cock the hammer. When I release the trigger, it should immediately reset and get back on the job. Nice reset. I'd like to point out now how short the stroke is on the trigger. We've gotten its motion down to about 1/16 of an inch, which is the shortest possible stroke, which also equals the quickest possible reset. The next function check we're going to do, gun is cocked, we're going to lock our safety on, and I'm going to pull the trigger 10 times. Of course the gun should not fire, nor should it fire when I turn the safety off. Just right. Let's check our dismantling. Take the Allen key supplied with your kit, 532, put it into the new two-piece bolt stop pin. It's going to be real tight when it's new. Break it loose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 revolutions. There's a relief cut on the pin. If you make it face the back of the receiver, the pin comes out easier. If you don't do it, the pin will still come out. It's just easier if it faces the back. And now you can slip your bolt out for nice, easy cleaning. Put your bolt back into the receiver tube. Now, the one thing I'd like to point out, I'll pause, let the camera catch up. In the hole, you will see a little bit of the recoil spring guide rod assembly protruding into the hole. The bolt stop pin that we put in is going to cam past that. So the way I like to do it, I like the gun muzzle down and control it, I put the bolt stop pin on the Allen key. So now I got a nice big key, just like a big old house key. Put the pin in and twist and push at the same time and it'll step right past the recoil spring guide. 4 or 5 revolutions, hand tight, and you're done. Trigger pull feels really good. Let's check it and see where we got. I'm going to use my Lyman digital trigger pull scale. The gun is not loaded, so you can hold the gun. 1 pound, 15.9 ounces, just a shade under 2 pounds. That is the Majestic Arms Master Grade Speed Strip Kit. Thank you very much for watching the video, and thank you very much for buying our products.